Today on Daily Dose Documentary, Labor Wars in American History. In one of the most stunning turning points in American history, following the end of the Civil War, the last 3 decades of the 19th century saw the nation transform from a rural agrarian republic into an urbanized industrial nation. Frontiers had largely vanished in the face of persistent westward expansion, while factories and steel mills began to dot the landscape, fueled by the steady arrival of immigrant labor flowing in through Ellis Island. After a proliferation of railroads dotted the East Coast and Midwest in the mid to late 19th century, followed by the first transcontinental railroad in 1869, the economic consequence of America's fast-expanding railways proved to be an elemental catalyst for the nation's emerging industrialization, growing from 57,000 track miles in 1870 to 167,000 track miles by 1890, while innovations such as air brakes and sleeping cars made rail travel smoother, safer, and more comfortable than any other means of transportation. Like falling dominoes in a row, when steam engine trains transitioned from wood to coal, the demand for coal tripled in less than a decade, and when rails and modern rail cars moved from iron to steel, the modern steel industry was duly born. Ancillary industries also emerged from the nation's growing rail industry, most notably Gustav Swift's development of the refrigerated freight car, which in turn birthed the meatpacking industry. Rapid American industrialization gave way to the Gilded Age, so named by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner's 1873 novel, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, a story which satirized the greed-inspired superficiality of the period, led by robber baron industrialists such as car maker Henry Ford, steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, oil titan John D. Rockefeller, shipping and rail tycoon Cornelius Vanderbilt, and financier J.P. Morgan. As domestic and foreign immigrants flocked to urban areas, cities found themselves stressed by overcrowding, while racial, cultural, and ethnic tensions led to bitter conflicts in densely packed cities. Housing, water, and other critical services such as sanitation, roads, and bridges were quickly made inadequate, while garbage collection efforts, police, and fire protection could not meet the needs of the fast-rising populations of city dwellers, leading journalist H.L. Mencken to describe the stench of 1880s Baltimore like a billion polecats. While robber baron industrialists lived in opulent excess, working-class Americans faced long hours, low wages, and oftentimes dangerous working conditions, leading to a rising sense of social and economic inequality rampant during the Gilded Age, which would ultimately lead to the progressive era reforms of the 1890s to the 1920s. As cities like New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh swelled with European and rural American immigrants in search of employment, competition for jobs further emboldened industrialists to keep wages as low as possible. Unfair wages and harsh working conditions during the Gilded Age and the entirety of America's Industrial Revolution quite naturally led to an era of rising tensions between robber barons and workers, leading to the birth of organizations such as the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor, or AFL, which sought to increase worker pay, improve working conditions, and establish a culture of workers' rights in a given industry. Rising tensions between industry and labor also led to a rising crescendo of labor strikes that often led to violent encounters with police or thugs recruited by management. Accordingly, Daily Dose Documentary takes a look at the top 10 most impactful labor strikes in what historians have collectively labeled the American Labor Wars. Born into poverty in Dunfermline, Scotland, by 1892, Andrew Carnegie had become one of the wealthiest industrialists in the United States, creating a conglomerate of steel mills through construction or acquisition under the banner of Carnegie Steel. That same year, his reputation as a philanthropist and vocal advocate of labor causes were put to the test when Carnegie set his focus on his newly acquired Homestead Steelworks near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, investing millions of dollars in an effort to retool the ailing plant for greater efficiencies, at the same time reducing wages on his 3,800-man workforce. In the course of implementing his business model, he turned to his chairman, Henry Frick, to do the dirty work. Of his Homestead workforce, 725 union workers band together against falling wages and the dangers of their workplace, and when Frick caught wind of an impending labor strike, he ramped up steel production in anticipation of a plant shutdown, leading to an escalating string of accidents under the hazardous working conditions in the plant. In the face of multiple deaths to a now overwhelmed and vocal workforce, Frick pushed back with a notice that Homestead Steel refused to negotiate with strikers, at the same time stating in no uncertain words that working conditions would remain unchanged. In response, 2,000 steel workers barricaded the entrance to the plant in an effort to block Frick from sending in strikebreakers, obliging Frick to hire 300 Pinkerton guards to clear the blockade. When the Pinkertons arrived by barge down the Monongahela River on the morning of July the 6th, workers and their families fired ancient guns and even an old cannon from their high ground position along the banks of the river. And when the Pinkertons returned fire with repeating Winchester rifles, 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons were killed, along with several dozen badly injured strikers and guards. The governor of Pennsylvania soon called in 8,500 National Guardsmen to lock down Homestead under martial law, while Carnegie's reputation suffered dearly when he failed to offer a public response while vacationing in Scotland. In what would become one of the most violent strikes in the early history of the American labor movement, the strikers' brutal treatment of the Pinkertons, even after their white flag surrender, would stain the image of labor unions in the court of public opinion, at the same time ending the use of Pinkerton mercenaries in future labor disputes, making the Homestead Strike of 1892 an early ignition point in the American labor movement. During the Panic of 1893, engineer-industrialist George Pullman laid off hundreds of workers employed by his Pullman sleeping car company, slashing wages to his remaining workforce by 30%. Furthering the hurt to his remaining employees, Pullman refused to lower rents and store prices in the company town of Pullman, some 15 miles south of downtown Chicago, obliging the entirety of his workforce to walk off their jobs in May of 1894. A month later, in a show of solidarity with Pullman workers, the American Railway Union, led by labor activist Eugene Debs, boycotted any train employing Pullman's luxury sleeping cars, effectively halting all rail traffic and commerce in 27 states west of Chicago. Officials from the General Managers Association, which represented Chicago-based railroad companies, petitioned the federal government to shut down the strike. And while labor unions were a major constituency of the Democratic Party, to show federal support of labor unions, Democratic President Grover Cleveland encouraged Congress to pass legislation in June, making the first Monday in September the legal holiday of Labor Day. The federal government's gesture failed to quell the violence that followed, when on June 29th, buildings and locomotives were set ablaze during a speech by Debs at Blue Island, Illinois, prompting U.S. Attorney General Richard Olney to seek a federal injunction against the strike and its leadership. A day later, Cleveland ordered federal troops to Chicago, despite angry protests from Illinois' pro-labor governor John Peter Altgeld, who had already ordered state militia troops to control the destructive actions of striking workers. Despite the governor's stance that Cleveland's orders were unconstitutional, on July the 6th, rioters destroyed hundreds of rail cars in South Chicago's sprawling rail depot, leading to a July 7th bloodbath when National Guardsmen opened fire on the angry mob, killing an estimated 70 strikers, while injuring 57 others. While the strike was declared over in early August, leading to Deb's arrest and 6-month imprisonment, the bloody struggle between labor and capital marked a period of rising public awareness of America's labor movement, which became a foundational element of the Progressive Era, making the Pullman Strike of 1894 a major uptick in federal oversight of a nation's economic and social equity. When the state of Massachusetts reduced maximum work week hours for women and children from 56 to 54, impoverished textile workers in Lawrence saw their average pay drop from $8.76 per week to $8.44, a difference that left many with the hard choice between eating a meal or going hungry. Known as Immigrant City, due to the town's melting pot diaspora of residents from 51 nations, after female and child workers at the Everett Mill walked off their jobs. When the news reached the city's wretched tenements that evening, by January 12, 1912, more than 10,000 workers had walked off their jobs in solidarity, protesting in frigid conditions with the communal cry of short pay, all out, and the ultimate call for dignity, we want bread and roses too. After their numbers continued to swell, some strikers began vandalizing the textile mills of Lawrence, prompting police and state militia to beat back the most aggressive offenders with billy clubs. Lacking even a hint of common culture or language, the Bread and Roses strike went viral in newspapers across the country, as journalists reported on how the ethnically diverse strikers employed soup kitchens, ethnic fraternities, community centers, and food donations by local farmers to feed their striking masses. After mill owners and city officials hired outside agitators to discredit the strikers in the court of public opinion, on January 29th, strikers attacked a streetcar carrying strikebreakers, resulting in an errant shotgun blast that led to the death of Anna Lopezzo, followed a day later by 18-year-old John Ramey after he was bayoneted in the shoulder by a militiaman. The violence led to what became a publicity coup known as the Children's Exodus, when striking parents sent 119 children to live with relatives and total strangers in Manhattan, while a second group of 46 children bound for Philadelphia met with violence when police in Lawrence dragged striking mothers by their hair as their traumatized children looked on. The horrendous optics in the national press led to hearings on Capitol Hill, shedding light on deplorable working conditions inside Lawrence mills, where respiratory infections caused by lint and dust revealed an average worker lifespan of 40 years. 14-year-old Carmelo Tioli shocked lawmakers when she recounted how a mill machine tore off her scalp, leaving her hospitalized for 7 months. Forced to capitulate under mounting outside pressure, mill owners agreed to a 15% wage hike, increased overtime pay, and a promise not to retaliate against strikers, making the Bread and Roses strike a landmark event in the American labor movement. In the lead-up to America's entry into the First World War, a sense of nationalism stoked tensions within the immigrant diaspora of most industrialized regions of the United States, and after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 toppled the reign of Tsar Nicholas II in lieu of socialist leaders like Vladimir Lenin, anxious Americans cast a suspicious eye upon labor unions, immigrants in general, African Americans, and the worry over the spread of homegrown socialism. As the nation's entry into the war caused labor shortages as able-bodied American men took up arms instead of shovels, labor unions, the federal government, and industrial employers became odd bedfellows under the guise of the War Labor Board, so chartered to fend off labor strikes through active mediation, which in turn witnessed a marked increase in worker pay, while daily work hours dropped from 12 to 8. That all ended following Armistice Day On November 11, 1918, when American industrial giants like U.S. Steel, the nation's largest employer, reinstated the 12-hour workday and refused to acknowledge labor unions. Still merged with the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers since the outbreak of war, the American Federation of Labor, or AFL, dragged their feet against demands by some 23 different craft unions to call a strike. And after union members began to abandon their union affiliations, on September 22nd, the Great Strike of 1919 began when half of the nation's steel workers, some 350,000, walked off their jobs in 6 states, creating a domino effect in a number of different industries that eventually saw 1/5 of the nation's labor force walk off their jobs. Companies soon took matters into their own hands, using the media to paint fears of a rising tide of homegrown socialism, ethnic tension between immigrant populations, and all-out racial bias against African Americans, leading to an uptick in the Red Scare of 1919 and 1920 that painted strikers as opportunistic socialists. They also tried to turn native-born workers against immigrant workers, while newspapers fed their readerships with rumors of Russian gold supporting the American labor movement. The backdraft of negative public opinion intensified when Big Steel hired African American strikebreakers, leading to deadly race riots in Gary, Indiana, Chicago, Illinois, Washington, D.C., and 23 other American cities. As labor unions took a beating in the court of public opinion, striking workers began to cross their own picket lines in defeat, leading to the strike's conclusion on January 8, 1920, making the Great Steel Strike of 1919 a most turbulent time in American history. After the United Auto Workers, or UAW, formed in 1935, American auto workers began a series of sit-down strikes in some of General Motors' smaller plants in Atlanta, Kansas City, and Cleveland the following year, striking for increased wages and improved working conditions during some of the bleakest days of the Great Depression. While the federal government had determined in 1935 that an annual salary of $1,600 was the absolute minimum on which a family of 4 could survive, GM workers earned a miserable $900, while the company spent a whopping $839,000 on private thugs known as the Black Legion, intent on intimidating UAW members. And when auto workers took control of GM's Flint, Michigan die-casting plant on December 30th, 1936, where just 2 sets of dies stamped out the majority of GM's car bodies, the action dropped the auto giant to its knees. GM argued that the strikers were trespassing, yet multiple court orders failed to remove the workers from their sit-down takeover of the Flint facility. Outside supporters supplied the workers with food and other necessities, and when GM turned off the heat to the buildings, the strikers simply wrapped themselves in coats and blankets and hunkered down. On January 11, 1937, police and company thugs tried to cut off the strikers' food supply, resulting in a riot quickly named by strikers as the Battle of the Running Bulls, which injured 16 workers and 11 policemen, plummeting GM's production of cars from 50,000 units in December to just 125 in February, after Michigan Governor Frank Murphy refused to use force to break the strike. President Franklin D. Roosevelt sent in the National Guard, but the guns of the Guard were not aimed at the striking workers, but at the police and hired goons, in a clear warning to leave the workers alone and for GM to recognize the workers' grievances. Now considered one of the most successful strikes of the 20th century, the 44-day sit-down strike ended on February 11, 1937, when GM President Alfred P. Sloan announced a $25 million pay raise, which in turn saw UAW membership rise from 30,000 to 500,000 members that same year, making the Flint sit-down strike of 1937 the first major win for organized labor in America. One of the most important strikes in American history began on September 8th of 1965, when over 2,000 Filipino and Mexican seasonal workers refused to pick the grape harvest in California's Central Valley near Delano, setting in motion a chain of work stoppages and protests that went on for 5 solid years of disruption, now known as the Delano Grape Strike. Encouraged by similar grape worker strikes organized by Filipino farm workers in the Coachella Valley on May 3, 1965, where growers granted farm workers a 40 cents per hour pay raise. But when the grape workers migrated north to Arvin, their attempted strike was broken up by police and growers at El Rancho Farms. Led by Larry Itliong, Philip Veracruz, and Benjamin Hines of the Agriculture Workers Organizing Committee, or AWOC, the Delano Grape Strike gained rapid support from Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers Union. But when grape growers hired Mexican farm workers to cross the picket lines, National Farm Workers Association leader Cesar Chavez initially declined Itliong's request for support under his belief that the NFWA was not financially stable enough to join the strike. To break his hesitation, Chavez asked the Mexican farm workers to vote on the matter, and when 1,200 workers packed into Our Lady of Guadalupe Church in Delano on September 16th, the workers overwhelmingly voted to join in the strike, which in turn led to the merger of the AWOC and the NFWA under the new name of the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee. Inspired by the nonviolent civil rights protests led by Martin Luther King Jr. and others, on March 17th of 1966, Chavez set out on a 300-mile pilgrimage and hunger strike from Delano to the state's capital in Sacramento, which attracted widespread public awareness to the plight of migrant grape workers and seasonal farm workers as well. His pilgrimage also inspired support from Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. The 5-year Delano Grape Strike led to repeated intimidation and harassment campaigns by police and growers, where the aggressors pushed and punched protesters, sprayed them with pesticides, and raced at picket lines in speeding vehicles, swerving away at the last possible moment, while also cutting off water supplies to the grape workers' dormitories. In response, Chavez encouraged the striking workers to not react against the violence, stating that we can change the world if we do it nonviolently. He also called for consumer boycotts on non-union grapes, leading American consumers to temporarily halt their purchases of grapes, while unionized longshoremen in California ports let all non-union grapes rot on shore rather than loading them into the holds of ships. Squeezed on both sides now, industry leaders finally came to the negotiating table in July of 1970, agreeing to pay grape pickers $1.80 an hour plus 20 cents for each box picked, while making substantial contributions to the union's health plan and ensuring that workers were protected from pesticide contamination in the fields. We said from the beginning that we were not going to abandon the fight, Chavez said after the grueling standoff and eventual victory. We said that we would stay with the struggle if it took a lifetime, and we meant it. Soon, all grapes will be sweet grapes again. Working long hours in every kind of weather, all for a lowly 65 cents an hour, or $5.62 in today's currency. When 2 Memphis sanitation workers were crushed to death by a faulty garbage truck compactor, 1,300 Memphis sanitation workers walked off their jobs when city officials refused to provide compensation to the deceased workers' families. On February 23, 1968, after Memphis Mayor Henry Loeb refused all concessions to the striking workers, police assaulted peaceful protesters with tear gas, prompting Nashville professor and civil rights activist Reverend James Lawson to call on his friend Martin Luther King Jr. with the hope of drawing attention to the strikers' plight. Building on MLK's Poor People's Campaign, which advocated for underprivileged Americans, On March 18th of that same year, King addressed a crowd of some 25,000 people about the dignity of labor by saying, "Whenever you are engaged in work that serves humanity, and it is for the building of humanity, it has dignity and it has worth." 10 days later, King returned to Memphis for another I Am a Man protest, which led to the death of an African-American teenager when an outside group infiltrated the Sanitation Workers' March. King would return to Memphis on April 3rd, delivering his "I've been to the mountaintop" speech, which proved to be a tragic foreshadowing of his assassination the following day.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee.
While MLK's assassination sunk a nation into deep mourning and widespread civil unrest in major American cities, it also overshadowed the Memphis sanitation workers' strike, prompting King's still grieving widow, Coretta Scott King, to return to Memphis to spotlight the cause of underpaid sanitation workers. Following Coretta's act of courageous solidarity, President Lyndon Baines Johnson sent his Undersecretary of Labor to Memphis to help mediate an equitable agreement. 2 weeks later, Memphis leaders officially recognized the workers' union while granting generous pay raises for its members, making the Memphis sanitation strike a bittersweet milestone during the heated years of the civil rights movement. By the end of the 1960s, pay raises for postal workers were virtually non-existent, rising by a scant $2,260 after 21 years of employment, despite the physical demands of the job, which led to turnover rates of 23% every 5 years. Tensions reached a boiling point, however, after Congress proposed a 41% pay raise in congressional salaries, while their proposed increase for postal worker pay clocked in at a dismal 5.4%. In response, letter carriers in New York called for a strike on March 17, 1970, and when union bosses from the National Association of Letter Carriers refused to strike on grounds that it was illegal for federal workers to do so, a group of New York pro-strike postal workers, led by Vincent Sombrado, defied union management and walked off their jobs the following morning.
Since Wednesday, when 6,500 New York City letter carriers refused to shoulder their mail pouches, the strike has spread from coast to coast. Now it directly affects 14 states and has involved about 200,000 postal workers.
You can't live in New York City on what they're giving us.
I've been told I'm eligible for welfare, but I don't want to take welfare.
As letter carriers took to picket lines in Manhattan, some 150,000 to 200,000 postal workers in 30 other cities followed suit, making the event the largest walkout of federal employees in U.S. history. At the same time, freezing delivery of some 270 million pieces of mail a day. In an age before the internet and email, documents critical to government, finance, and other industries were sidelined in postal warehouses, at the same time bringing financial hardships to poor people waiting on welfare checks, while young men fearful of being drafted into the Vietnam War were left to worry if they were about to be called up for active duty or exempted from the war. In response to the mounting logjam, President Richard M. Nixon declared a federal emergency, calling in the National Guard to deliver the mail in an effort to keep the American economy on track.
What exactly are you doing?
I don't really know.
Do you think you're doing it as fast as a postal worker?
No, I don't.
And after 8 days of sorting and delivering mail by inexperienced reservists, the Wildcat strikers went back to work on Nixon's promise of a retroactive pay hike of 6%, followed by an additional 8% after Nixon signed the Postal Reorganization Act on August 12th of that same year, making the Great Postal Strike of 1970 a time of letterless stagnation for Americans everywhere. Since its formation in 1968, PATCO, or the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, had a long history of sick-out protests against the rigid edicts placed upon them by the controller's employer, the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA. The sickouts caused major delays at airports across the United States and abroad, yet by existing federal law, the government union was unable to strike. While PATCO had endorsed Democratic Party candidates since its inception, in 1980, the union refused to back President Jimmy Carter due to ongoing poor labor relations with the FAA, instead backing GOP presidential candidate Ronald Reagan. When contract negotiations began in February of 1981 between PATCO and the FAA, citing safety concerns, PATCO called for a reduced 32-hour work week, a $10,000 pay increase, and a better retirement package than the one they currently enjoyed. When the FAA refused to budge on a shortened work week, at 7 a.m. on August 3, 1981, the union declared a strike. Despite supporting Reagan in 1980, Reagan declared the striking federal workers a peril to national safety, ordering them back to work under the terms of the Taft-Hartley Act. With only 1,300 of the nearly 13,000 controllers responding to Reagan's order, on August 5th, 2 days after the strike began, the president fired 11,345 striking federal controllers.
Let me read the solemn oath taken by each of these employees in a sworn affidavit when they accepted their jobs. I am not participating in any strike against the government of the United States or any agency thereof, and I will not so participate while an employee of the government of the United States or any agency thereof. It is for this reason that I must tell those who fail to report for duty this morning they are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated. End of statement.
The mass firings left a huge shortage of certified controllers, forcing airlines to dramatically cut back on the number of flights the system could handle, further prompting the FAA to move supervisors and military controllers into control towers across the nation. While the FAA initially claimed that staffing levels would be restored within 2 years, in reality, it took 10 before pre-strike staffing levels were finally achieved. Home to some 500 garment factories employing an approximate 20,000 members of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, or ILGWU, Local 23-25, the garment workers' strike took place in New York City's Chinatown district in 1982, when mostly Chinese immigrants from Hong Kong and southern China went on strike against hazardous working conditions, brutally long hours, and a payment system based on piecework rather than the 1981 minimum wage of $3.35 an hour, or $11.10 an hour in today's currency. During its 3-year renegotiation cycle in 1982, the 150,000-member ILGWU held contract talks with manufacturers represented by the American Apparel Manufacturers Association, or AAMA, and contractors represented by the Greater Blouse, Skirt, and Undergarment Association, or GBSUA, this time calling on a strike for any manufacturer or contractor who employed a non-union firm in their day-to-day operations. As the talks progressed, Chinatown contractors rejected GBSUA's proposed contract deal, instead presenting their own list of demands, maintaining that the union, not the contractors, should provide holiday pay, while overtime was to be calculated on a weekly rather than a daily basis. They also maintained that they should be free to do business with non-union manufacturers if union work was not immediately available, threatening to secede from the GMSUA if their demands were not met. The conflict soon sparked competing propaganda campaigns between the union and Chinese contractors, the latter pleading for ethnic loyalty against a white-dominated union, leading Union President Saul Chaikin to label the contractors' demands an attempt to create a Taiwan in the United States and turn the union clock back 50 years. Ultimately siding with the Union, thousands of Chinese union members formed the Committee to Defend the Union Contract, volunteering on weekends and after work to hand out flyers on the streets of New York City in an attempt to bolster public awareness. Led by Shui Mak Ka, Lily Moy, Alice Tsie, Alice Ip, and Katie Kwan, on June 24th of 1982, some 20,000 garment workers held a rally in Columbus Park, carrying banners and picket signs that ended in a march through Chinatown, leading Katie Kwan to recall years later that it was an exhilarating moment. Thousands upon thousands of Chinese immigrant women had come together to stand up for themselves. Several days after the rally, all but a couple of dozen Chinatown contractors had pledged to sign the union contract, sparking a second rally on June 29th, which threatened the holdout contractors with a focused boycott on any contractor who failed to sign the union contract. Drawing an equally large crowd as the rally on June 24th, within hours, every holdout contractor had signed the protesters' contract, ending the garment worker strike of 1982 with a resounding victory for union workers. And there you have it, labor unions in American history, today on Daily Dose Documentary. Today's Daily Dose Documentary is brought to you by PlatoSpeech.com, a lesson planning tool leveraging content like this and much more for educators and homeschooling parents. Check out the description for more information so that you too can teach something new every day.